The sea wore its old familiar smell, tar and salt and cold iron. The breath of the islands that had once been a boy's whole world and now felt like the back of a half-remembered dream. Spray broke over the prow in torn white sheets, and he tasted brine on his lips as the ship shouldered into the swell. Lantern light swung beneath the yard, a pendulum of gold that cut and recut the same circle in the black. Ahead, the blasted shape of Pike rose from the waves, a broken crown of towers on knife-slender stacks. The night closed in around the ship like the mouth of some great thing, and Theon Greyjoy stood with one hand braced on the rail, jaw tight, and tried to keep Winterfell from softening inside him. He had thought, once, that coming home would be like drawing breath after being held underwater. In his boyhood he had dreamed of his father's hand on his shoulder, the blast of the war horn, the ring of iron on iron while men shouted his name. He had dreamed of salt wives and thralls and the sea's cold bride. But he had dreamed as a boy who slept before a hearth of sweet pine logs beneath a roof that never leaked, in a warm keep where a wolf's silence sat upon the stone and the gods were leaves and wind and water. The dreams had not known the taste of stew in the common hall, or the way a maester's soft voice could thread years into softer things. Book stories and letters, the straight lines of ledgers, nor the weight of a lord's hand on the nape of his neck, patient and grave. The islands smelled like rain and rust. He let the salt lie on his tongue until his pulse steadied. The helmsman's voice came up in a rasp. The tide was turning. Towers loomed and fell away, black and bleaker still, cut by gull cries that sounded like laughter without mirth. The harder he tried not to think of Winterfell, the more stubbornly it came. Light on glass in the godswood, Bran's face lit by candle somewhere deep in stone, Robb's wolfish grin with snow melting in his hair, a half-played game of Sivas in a solar that never feared the sea. "Pike," the captain said, as if the word might make it kinder. Theon nodded as if he agreed. The landing was as he remembered it. Ropes that creaked, oars that groaned, the squall's last wet hands running their sleeves along the walls. He climbed the slick steps cut into the rock and tried to keep his shoulders from recalling the lithe swagger he had worn like a coat when he left these stones as a child. He had been 10 then, angry and bright. He was 20, harder and brighter in the wrong ways. The wind was a bitter hand in his hair. Balon Greyjoy met him in a hall that had never known softness. No tapestries hid the damp in the walls. The rushes were old and smelled of eel. Theon's father looked like a piece of the rock had decided to be a man. His beard was iron gray and ill-tempered. His eyes were small and pale as the sea on a winter noon. Theon crossed the rushes, stepped into a place the wind had claimed and kept, and bowed. He waited for a hand on his shoulder, not from hope but because a bone-deep stubbornness in him insisted on imagining what rightness might be. "Father," he said. Balon's gaze moved to him as a gull's might, to see if he were edible. "Do you call yourself Greyjoy in that Southron mouth?" he asked. His lip curled. "You stink of wolf." Theon smiled as he had been taught, easy and bright with a threat coiled in it, charming because charm was the coin of the powerless. "Wolves eat iron when they can find it," he said. "Better to hunt with the wolf than to be prey." "You were never prey," Balon said. "You were the price of my pride. Ask Lord Stark what he feasts upon when he's hungry." His gaze lifted to the walls, as if the old stones had kept the name of Ned Stark in a crack to mock him. "You bring me letters," Balon went on, "and soft talk of alliances. They sent a boy to bargain with a king." Behind Theon, men laughed. Asha stood with one boot on the step of the dais, her hair damp from the salt, dark as old oak. She had half her smile angled already. It always looked as though the rest of it had been left in her pocket for later mischief. Theon went to her in his head sometimes to test his sharpness. Cut both ways, but it laughed as it cut, and that mattered more than he liked. He inclined his head. She winked, and that was all. "Robb Stark asks for ships," Theon said, his voice level. "He would make you strong in the mainland. He would have you raid Lannisport again or cut west to Fair Isle with the Fry crossing secured. The Lion's eyes are at Riverrun and King's Landing. His back is careless." "Robb," Balon said, tasting the name as if it might be rotten. You kneel as if my hall were his. You make me shame in front of my own blood." Theon folded away the words he almost said. He had thought of the iron price until the thought made sleep short and sour. He had thought of walking these stones with his name burning on his shoulders and the door to every bed unbarred. He had thought it and thought it and thought it and found when he came that the thought had turned to ash. Robb's hand on his neck, steady as if it belonged there. Bran's fingers on his sleeve. A direwolf's yellow eyes blinking at him like a living oath. How could he explain any of that to a man whose heart was stone? "You have no ships to spare," Theon said. He watched Asha's eyes narrow. Approval that he played truth more often now. "You mean to make your own war? You mean to send longships up the stony shore and the fever river and to bring the Northmen to their knees while Robb is in the west? You mean to cut the north in the belly while it's stretched thin?" Balon's smile was very thin. "You can learn," he said. "You would have saved me the trouble of telling you. Will you be king of scorched villages and puffed up raiders?" Theon asked before he could stop asking. "The north is a winter that never ends. As men stand, they will stand through this and through what comes. You will burn the fields and steal the sheep, and then what? Will the Greyjoy name be a curse murmured in 100 cold halls? I was hostage to you and it made me iron. I was ward to them and it made me a man. If you raise your banners against Winterfell, the old gods will not turn their faces. They will watch with their endless white eyes, and they will remember you." A breeze moved the torches. Asha's mouth lost its humor. Balon's voice dropped until Theon could feel it in his bones. "If you bring raven-wet words from wolves to me, you will leave the way ravens leave, boy. And if you speak to me of gods in their trees, take your wolf's toys and go find a grove to cry in. I am the storm. I am his son. We do not ask men to be our friends." Later, Theon sat with the old maester, Wendemer, in a turret that smelled of damp parchment and smoke. The key ring lay heavy on the man's breast. His hair was thin as cobweb. "I loved you as a boy," the maester said plainly, rolling a small white rook between fingers swollen at the knuckles. "You learned fast. You ate books like bread. You wanted praise, so you smiled instead of roaring. Men will forgive a roar. They fear a smile." "I was taught to smile," Theon said. "They made me well at it." He paced the cold floor. His boot heels knocked the quiet hard. "He will strike the north where it bleeds slowest. He will send Asha to Deepwood Motte, the old way. He will use every breath to cut us off from the south." "Us," Wendemer repeated gently. Theon heard the word after he said it, and the echo had knives in it. "Luwin will hold Winterfell with old men and boys," Theon said. "Ser Rodrik will do what he can, but he cannot be everywhere. Robb is in the west. He trusts me to come back with ships, and I have brought him a storm." Wendemer looked at him a long time. "Balon will not keep you long," he said. "Not in the hall, not within the walls. He will put you on a ship with fish-eaters and expect you to prove yourself with a raid he does not care about. It will be your knife and your leash." He set the rook down and folded his hands like tired birds. "We could send a raven." "His men watch the rookery," Theon said. "Asha knows that trick better than I. And if a raven flies for the wolf, who will he bring to heel first? Me. He will make a lesson." Wendemer's expression was something past sadness, as if he were measuring the weight of a story he had seen before and could not change. "There is a fisherman," he said at last. "Hagen. He has a daughter with eyes like rain. He owes me his son's life. A fever took him and I held him, watching the poison leave through his sweat. Hagen will take you to Seaguard if you go by night, in a skin boat that will make the sea laugh at you and let you pass. You will ride north from there. That is one way. Or you can do as boys do and stay where they don't belong, and wear smiles and daggers until they grow through your skin and they are you." Theon closed his eyes. Winterfell came to him then, a blessing that was also a wound. Robb's dog-quick laugh. A hallway where he had once run arrows down his fingers like they were coins. The Godswood's heart tree with its long red leaves like old water, whispering. He did not kneel then. He put both hands on the window stone and let his fingers feel the cold of the island through the tower. "Help me," he said. The maester had the small sound that old men make when they stand up too fast. "You are my boy," he said. "You and none of them. I will help you." They went in the worst hour, before the world remembered light. The rope bit Theon's hands until he welcomed the bite. It reminded him he could still be hurt, that he had a shape. The cliff face was black and slabbed and wet. The boom of the sea below was a heart, too large and too close. He did not look down often. By the time his boots found the sea-wet ledge where Hagen's skin boat waited like a piece of wind turned solid, Theon felt as if he had been peeled. Wendemer's breath smoked in the dark. The old man's hand on Theon's wrist felt like a vow made of bones. "Take the water," the maester said to Hagen. "Some men are born from it. He is not one of them. He needs the land more than he knows." Hagen's daughter held the tiny lantern. When she lifted it, Theon saw how her eyes had caught the light. He nodded to her because he had always nodded to girls. She did not smile at him. She bent to her father's work, hands quick. They pushed off, and the black water took them like a mother who had never known them. There are oars you learn when you are small. There is the way the sea ignores your belief that you shape it. Theon had thought he knew both things. He learned better. They went low and silent under the shoulder of rock, and the foam was only breath around them. The land fell away, the last torch on a tower blinked and vanished, and the sea was all the world. A skin of iron under a sky so high it hurt to see what was beyond seeing. At Seaguard the bells rang slow over the gray stone keep, and men with Mal-Lister purple on their sleeves stared as if he were a story that had walked out of a cup. "Greyjoy," one of them said, with a flint edge, "we don't keep your kind for long. Keep me until I have said what I came to say." Theon answered, calling the smile that had served him so well and worn him so thin. "You can throw me off the tower after." He did not sleep more than the blink of a gull in the 4 days it took him to reach Robb's camp. The young wolf had pushed hard through rain and an old ache in everything. He found Robb in a field that had been a deer's dream once, now churned to brown by 1,000 boots. The king turned, and for an instant Theon forgot what to do with his face. He simply looked. Robb's hair was longer, his eyes older, his jaw set in a line that had learned to hold. Grey wind smelled Theon first and came with his great head low, and the wolf's eyes found Theon's hands where they had bled from the rope, and he wuffed, as if this was a smell he might allow. "Theon," Robb said, and had his hand on Theon's shoulder, steady as if nothing had been broken in the world. "They told me you'd crossed the Boar's Road. Did you make your father bend?" "He will not bend," Theon said. "He means to break you where he can, and where he cannot, he will try the world instead." They sat in the king's tent with the map between them, white as the soft belly of a fish. Catelyn Stark stood with her mouth thin and a mother in her eyes, measuring Theon as one might measure a blade for Nyx. The Greyjoy's laughter shook the canvas once and fell away when he saw Theon's face. Maester Vyman's breath made small clouds in the air by the brazier. It was late autumn, and the brown in the trees had a near taste of snow. Theon told them, and when he reached the part where he had heard Asha's name joined to Deepwood Motte, something in him twisted. He did not let it show on his mouth. "They will run the stony shore inside out," he said. "They will take woods and fish and small words, handfasts and babies, the taste of fear. They will jump across creeks and burn, and then they will slide back into the sea and laugh because the water is still theirs. They will try Moat Cailin, too. If they take it, you come north to a swamp without a way through. If they cannot hold it, they will burn the causeways and make you slower. Ser Roderick must hold Winterfell," Catelyn said. "Bran," she stopped, as if a hand had closed on her throat. It was not a hand Theon could see. "Bran must have men. The boys must be safe." Theon looked down at his hands, open on the map like a man surrendering. "Let me ride," he said. "I know them. I can smell the old way when I see it, and I can find the places your men do not look for. Send riders north and call the tall men to their banners. They will come. Send word to Barrowton and the Dreadfort, even to the Riswells if you must, though I'd sooner hold my nose. The Manderleys will keep the sea if you ask them. I will go to Winterfell and to Moat Cailin, and I will do what has to be done." I will not let them into your house. You speak as if it were yours, Caitlin said, and he could not read her voice. It is where I learned to stand, my lady, he said. Rob's eyes were on his. You left your father's hall, the king said. The words were simple. What was under them was not. He will call you traitor. Theon nodded once. He already had the word in his mouth. I will hold you to this, Rob said. He did not smile. Theon would not have given him his cheap coin of a grin. He had more expensive things now. Go! They came into Winterfell as the first real cold laid its hand on the land. Theon had forgotten how the smoke smelled there. Good smoke, dry wood over a steady fire. The breath of the kitchens mingled with snow. The walls were like old friends who had gone quiet with age. He rode under the gate with a company of helmed men and saw Bran waiting in the yard. The boy was a man now in ways that did not show in his shoulders. He sat his saddle with calm and held the reins lightly. A thick cloak lay over his legs, and the fur at his collar made his face look even younger. His hair had grown and lay heavy on his brow. Theon swung down, and the winter air held him for a heartbeat and released him. He went to Bran and bowed. He did not know why he bowed. He did it because he could not do anything else. Bran smiled, small and straight. The stag-hilted knife at his belt was newly oiled. You rode, he said. I dreamt you before you came. You had salt on you and a gull in your hand. I had both, Theon said, and tried to make it light. Came out like something else, and he let it be. I come with ugly words. I bring men. We have few enough, Maester Luwin said, appearing at Theon's shoulder like memory. We have boys and old hunters. We have Ser Roderick's arm and my ink. We could use more blades, and some of them had better know where to cut. They sat in the solar where the ravens muttered secrets to themselves. Ser Roderick's mustaches seemed grayer than Theon remembered, and his chest broader and his patience shorter. You were always a cocky puppy, the old knight told him, and then, because he could be cruel when it mattered, added, You cut clean though. I'll take your edge. Theon told them where the longships would come. The inlets too small to matter until they mattered. The caves where the sea slept and woke hungry. He took a bit of charcoal and smeared it across the map until the stony shore looked like a hand with black fingers. He found himself laughing once when Osha, standing by the fire with her sharp eyes on all of them, snorted at a thing he said about Ironborn pride and their love of raiding haystacks. We'll see whose pride drowns first, he said, and Bran looked up at him so keenly that Theon almost flinched. That night, Theon went to the Godswood alone. The pool was iron-black, and the heart tree's pale bark showed the deep cuts of the old face that looked like a wound that had forgotten to close. He did not know the old prayers. He had heard them said in that thin north voice, and he had watched men kneel and watched wind move the leaves and had felt a thing he could not name looking at him from behind the world. The winter stars seemed closer among those branches. He swallowed his pride until it hurt. Watch me, he said to the leaves. If you are there, watch, and if you are not, that is fine. I will be here anyway. I will stand where they cannot. When he turned, Bran was watching from the half-shadow. He had learned stealth from wolves and a woman from beyond the wall. He rolled his horse forward and stopped with a hand on the trunk of an elm. The white moon cut his face into something at once new and old. You don't belong to the sea, Bran said. You belong to here, only you did not know it. The trees told me. They said that one came long ago and he never left. Theon laughed then because he could not weep in front of a boy and keep breathing. I belong to the next fight, he said. Tell your trees that. What followed took on the hard press of work. Ser Roderick sent summoned men riding to the Hornwood lands with a message that would sit in certain ears like a thorn. Ramsay Snow was making free with other men's widows again in his father's shadows, and it would not stand. The Manderleys sent galleys to White Harbor's mouth and promised to patrol as far as their fat hulks could bully the sea. A rider went south with Theon's hand to Robb. Another rode east to Barrowton. A third took a twisted path into the bogs with words for a people who moved their houses and fed their children on air and frogs when they must. The Raven to Greywater Watch went with a ribbon around its leg and a hair bound into a knot the way the Crannogmen liked it. When men laughed at the knot, Theon let them. He had learned that laughter could be a sail, catching winds that drove ships where you wanted. They met the first longships at a cove near the Fever River where the land folded itself into privacy and the water lipped at stone as if tasting it. Theon had taken 50 men into the dark with him, 36 bowmen who knew how to hit a man from trees and not cough, 24 with axes and good boots and the sense to lift their feet high. He had men from the winter town with hands like the roots of old oaks. Osha went with them because she said they smelled like fools and would run where snow would happily drink them if left alone. The longships came in on a wind that thought it had made them. The oars slipped into the black with barely a whisper. The shields along the gunwales shone like the luck of brave men. The first Ironborn down the plank into the shallows had daggers in their teeth, because a life is a stage and men die for display as often as for coin. The second man leaped and laughed, and the arrow took him under the collarbone. Then the trees stopped being trees and started being a trap. Theon's bow sang because it had missed that sound. He moved as Robb had taught him to move in the green, while gray wind moved somewhere ahead of them in a smell of fur and hunger. The Ironborn shouted, and then they shouted less, and then they cursed, and then they asked the sea for help. The sea waited in its silence because the sea never hurries. Dagmar Cleftjaw came from the second boat, his face like a ruined sail. Theon remembered him as a hand on his shoulder once, a laugh, a bit of old salt that had tasted of story. He watched the man take in the shape of the shore, the way the trees did not move, and watched him name their death with his eyes. Dagmar gave an order Theon had heard since he was small. Backwater, backwater, and the oars bit and the boat slid away, like a beast that knows when it has lost a meal. Theon rose from the ground where the ferns had kept him. Arrow knocked. The man turned then and saw Theon. They looked at each other for a breath and then another. Dagmar's ruined mouth cracked a smile. "Welp," he said without heat. "They made a wolf's pet out of you." "They made a man," Theon said. Dagmar had time to be pleased at the answer. Then Osha put a spear through his boatmate, and the shore screamed because battle is stupid noise. Theon loosed and the arrow took Dagmar in the throat at an angle that would be a story told in 2 beds at least, and then Theon had no more arrows, only close work. He would remember the sound of axes in water and the way men's breath fogged and rave of gulls above as if they were excited by blood. By dawn, the cove was quiet save for groans and the sound the sea makes when it is content with what it has licked. They built a small pyre for their own dead and let the rest go into the water because Ironborn belonged to it, and a man should be sent to what will claim him either way. Theon watched the last longship's stern vanish around the far tooth of rock and knew Asha would hear before noon. She did. Deepwood Mott fell to her the way a door falls when it has been forgotten to be barred. The Glover men were brave and few. They met her with axes and the women of the woodlands with bows. But the surprise was a blade no armor sees coming. Asha took the hall and took the stores and took a laugh, loud and round as an apple. She sent men out like dark birds to gather day-old bread and fear. Theon heard it in Winterfell the next day and tasted something like gall. He went west with 160 men, hard as nails and twice as likely to smite a thumb. Ser Roderick cursed him for a fool and then put his hand on Theon's shoulder under the guard of men who watched and said, "If you die, boy, I shall be annoyed." Theon laughed in the old way and rode. He sent 2 men to find Galbart Glover, who was chewing his anger somewhere with his brother Robert and dreaming in iron ways of work to be done to the Harlaw men and their ships. In the green fringes of the forest, Theon saw small things that would not have mattered to another man. Nets hung with stones to make a sound like birds, the sign of a longship in the way a creek's mouth looked smooth old footprints brought alive by night dew. He used them. They came on Deepwood Mott at dawn with the fog, with Moore's umber bellowing as if he could wake the dead and borrow their hands. It was not a quick fight, but Theon found it good. There was a rhythm to killing when it was clean and aimed. He thought of Robb's lessons and of Roderick's, of how you keep distance until you spend it like coin, then close and use the butt of your axe because men forget the butt. He found Ralph kenning in the yard with a circle of men around him and threw his voice like a net. "Kenning," he called. "Lay down or I give you a wolf's death." Kenning spat in a way that was meant for story. He was brave and he died because brave men die as fast as cowards. Asha came in time to see high. Fall, blood on her cheek and sea in her hair. She swung from her saddle with the grace of a woman who had known how to stand in something that moved beneath her since before she bled. Greyjoys meet like storms or not at all. They met in the soft white day, and it smelled of wet wood and iron. "You shoot like a lordling who had a master," she said, breath easy. "I wondered if they had made you delicate. You look thin." "You look like home," Theon said, and found it hurt. "Stand down." Her laugh was relief and refusal both. "From you, little brother, if I make a habit of stepping aside when men with good cheekbones tell me to, I should be pulped now." She looked beyond him and saw the sign of men in the trees. "I'll take my ships and go," she said after a moment's counting. "Not because you ask it, but because I would rather push you off my deck in a warm harbor than bleed you on a cold hill. I have what I came for." "You have my men," Robert Glover said roughly, coming up at Theon's shoulder like a promise. "You have my sister's chair and her dog and her pantry. Give them back." She studied him, then Theon. She was very quick when she needed to be. It had saved her once at least from falling into a life with less wind. "Your boy has teeth," she told Theon. "Keep him. He'll be useful when the wolves decide to eat their own." She lifted her hand, whistled. Men moved in the way of men who have decided to quit the field and keep their skins. "Look for me on the sea," she said, and because she was who she was, she grinned. "If you look long enough, everyone sees me there." They let her go because they had to, because holding her would have cost more blood in a town that had already given enough, and because Theon's name bent itself behind his ribs and said, "Not like this." Robert Glover's hurt bit him as hard as any wound. "You let her," Robert said. Theon nodded and bore it. When the bells stopped ringing and the dead were counted and the dogs fed and the stores measured, Theon wrote to Robb with his hands sore and his head hollow and told him what he had done. He told him what he had not done and let ink stand where his tongue would have stammered. He slept an hour and dreamed of a bridge that moved beneath a man in a storm, and Balon standing black on it like a piece of the night. Winterfell felt the war in shudder and slack. Theon moved through it like a thread that had finally found its needle. He worked Moat Cailin with the reeds, strange people, quiet and fierce, who knew the bog as other men know a beloved's body. Mira walked beside him with a frog spear and a smile that looked like she made it herself, prying it from mud, and Jojen's green dreams sat behind his eyes like a weather he could not share. "In another river of time you were colder," the boy told Theon once, and Theon laughed at him because it was that or take Jojen by the shoulders and shake him until a dream fell out. They made the neck a throat that choked Ironborn as they tried to swallow it. Men sank because Crannig spears bit ankles and men laughed. Theon led a night raid that walked on reeds, and the Ironborn never saw them until they felt the water moving in ways water doesn't when oars don't know. He knew where a man would put his foot and when he would hesitate, if he had been born to sea and given land as a joke. He cut as he had promised he would cut. He sent letters like arrows, and they went to White Harbor and came back heavy with manderly oaths and fat fish and a ship with a green-painted prow that belonged to a merchant who liked coin more than caution. The map slowly stopped bleeding and started to blush more slowly. In the south, things went on breaking. Ravens told of bright wildfire on black water and Stannis' fleet flaring like a festival, then turning to cinder. They told of the Tyrells riding into King's Landing with silks billowing, of a girl with roses on her sleeves leading men to bachelors' beds, of a monster praying to a god he did not know. Theon could not tell if that was rumor or truth, but it made the telling better. They told of Tywin Lannister's face when he heard that Jaime did not ride into the yard because Jaime still sat in a northern tent with his hands and his mouth intact and his honor not much more or less than before the war. They told of Freys who were pleased because men had remembered their worth and would pay it. They told, in the end, simply that war continued. Robb Stark sent for his mother and for his bride in the way that kings send for bread when their stomachs are busy with older things. Pragmatic, patient, with a part of him watching for treachery that prefers to hide in lineages and bedding. He married a Fry girl whose name the river itself seemed to keep, cool and carrying. She had dark eyes and the kind of laugh that could ride over a hall without cutting. Walder Fry smiled as if he had eaten sour fruit that still surprised him by being sweet. The tents at the Twins lifted in a wind that smelled of bannermen and beer. The king in the north was young and not yet a ghost, and the river called him grandson. Theon went at Robb's summons and watched the words of vows braid themselves into a net that might hold a world. He stood with the Grachan's shoulder warm against his on one side and Catelyn's eyes on the other, and he felt like a word that had finally found its sentence. He drank and let the mead bristle his lips and listened to men talk as if winter had ears. When talk turned to Bolton's, it grew softer. Roose had kept to the work of a good vassal. Numbers and patience and little victories that looked more like accounting than blood. His bastard's name slid through camps like worms in old fruit. The Hornwood widow had been taken, used as if she were a skin to make a drum, and then she had been found in a tower with her fingers chewed because hunger yields nothing to shame. Theon held that in him as if it were a hot coal he might need to put in someone. LSC's mouth later. He asked Robb to let him ride east. Robb nodded after a moment in which he might have been measuring Theon's bones for a coffin. Take Roderick, he said. If Ramsay has his father's shadow and none of his patience, you'll need a steady hand. They found snow on the high fields and ash in a village with a dog still tied to a post, whining. Men had been taken and women. They did not find bodies because Ramsay's mercy was not the kind that left witness. They moved into the Dreadfort's shadow like winter in a story, creeping at the corners of men's windows until the candles shivered. Roose opened his gates to them with a face like a still pond. "My boy," he said, in a voice so mild the snow might not have noticed it. "I told him to keep his hands from that. Boys do not learn by words." He offered bread and salt and the rules that hold men when nothing else does. Theon took them and ate and felt like he had swallowed a knife's idea of a meal. Ramsay was not there. He had gone too far south after a caravan of hides and girls on a rumor he had heard in a tavern from a man who had wanted to keep all his teeth. Theon set Osha to following men who had been to that tavern. She returned with mud to her knees and the look of a woman who had seen something that made her wish she hadn't. "He wears another man's stink when it serves," she said. "He puts on a name like a shirt. He had a reek once he used for his crimes. Now he is a reek with a Bolton grinning out of him." They moved at night, the wind like fingers finding all the places armor left unloved. They caught him near Barrowton where the mounds rose like the backs of sleeping kings. He had 30 men and more swagger than sense, and Theon put an arrow past his ear for the sake of memory and watched the bastard blink. "I know you," Ramsay said, curious as a boy finding a beetle. "You're that sea bitch. Come get drowned," Theon said, since swagger is sometimes a tool. They pulled him down under gray sky with the barrows keeping their secrets. He tried to run and found snow deep where he did not expect it. Ser Roderick took his men with method and one by one, clacking them away like old bones. Osha hamstrung a horse when it mattered. Theon went for Ramsay with a speed even he did not know he owned. They went to the ground together. Ramsay's knife found Theon's jerkin and made a new mouth in it. Theon's hand found Ramsay's hair and told it what hair is for. They rolled in old grass in silence until Theon's knee came down on a wrist and the knife jumped out and joyfully bit dirt. Ramsay's eyes were pale and puny and full of rules he had learned wrong. "I can call my father," he said. "He will unmake you in ways you'll tell stories to keep sane." "My father is the sea," Theon said, "because truth at the right angle can cut a man. But my home is stone." He put the point of his knife under Ramsay's ear where the jaw jumps and pushed. It was not elegant. It was something else he recognized. Necessary. They took Ramsay's ring and sent it to Roose with courtesy, as if returning an accidental theft. After, Theon sat in the barrow grass and didn't allow his hands to shake until the men had gone a dozen paces. When he let them shake, no one saw but a rook in a thorn who had questions he would never ask. Ser Roderick patted his shoulder the way old men pat wolves and said, "Good. He was the sort that makes boys like you into something worse if they live long enough. You spared us a story." They were almost back to Winterfell when the storm came through like an argument the gods were having with the land. The snow scratched at their eyes and the wind made words at their ears. They forced their horses and themselves forward and came into the gates with frost on their beards and their cloaks stiff as boards. In the great hall, the hearths roared like applause. Bran sat by the fire, Jojen and Mira on either side like the weighing pans of a scale no one could read. Old Nan's chair sat empty. Someone had hung a sprig of dried leaves over it in her memory, and it rustled when the door closed. "You look like men the storm spat out because it didn't like the taste," Osha told them. "Eat." They ate. They drank something that burned like life. Bran watched Theon over his cup, his eyes the color of winter when it's thinking. Later, in the Godswood, the boy came to him and said, "You have a road on you." "I just rode one," Theon said, tired of riddles and yet needing them like salt. Jojen spoke from behind Bran with the voice of a boy who had never been taught to be afraid of the truth. "He dreams you when you are not where you are." Theon looked up at the white face of the heart tree and felt his life lay itself out like a blade. "I will go where I am needed," he said, and thought of the neck and of the smell of the sea a day's ride away, and of a hall full of green things that belonged to someone else that had nevertheless kept him alive when he was too small to know it. "But I do not leave Winterfell unless it is what keeps you standing." They did not ask him to go north through the wild beyond the wall. They did not ask him to put his hand in the Night's Watch stewpot and stir until it looked like food. The gods or luck or Rob's care made sure his work lay elsewhere. He spent a winter in pieces, riding to the rills to bark the Risswells into line when one of them took to pretending his levies were his goats and he had lost them, bolstering White Harbor when a ship with a squid on it appeared and then vanished, teaching boys not to shoot their own feet when the bow sat heavy. He learned what bread tasted like when it was earned by days that left you footsore and amused, and what meat tasted like when it washed the ash out of your throat. He learned to sleep in armor and to take it off fast because sometimes the best way to live was to be faster at removing burdens than another man. And then the raven came about Balan, came at dusk, and the hall felt a fraction colder when the bird's shadow crossed the door. Wendemer's cramped hand gave the simple fact as if he were naming the weather. Balan had fallen from a bridge in a gale and the sea had walked up and eaten him. The wind had taken his crown and the islands were whispering, as they always whispered when the word king changed its clothes. Theon held the letter. It was ink and effort, nothing else. He felt it like a hand that had both stroked and struck him. He did not weep, because his father had not been a man you could weep for without lying to the dead and yourself. He did not smile. He went to the Godswood again and stood with the heart tree watching him as if it had put him aside but not out of mind. "Will you go?" Bran asked him later, voice quiet and plain. "It is not my place," Theon said. He had never said a truer thing. "If I go, I am a banner with no pole. If I stay, I am a man. Let them make kings out of anything they like. The sea takes us all at the end. Let them put a driftwood crown on Euron's head, if he returns. Let Victarion beat his chest until his ships break down from listening. I will hold this." Bran nodded once, as if he had known that answer. "The trees said so," he added, and Theon laughed because Winterfell could be gentle with its certainties. The winter deepened and then, in one of those jokes the seasons like to play on men, softened enough to make travel ugly. Mud swallowed hooves and manshins both. The road to White Harbor became a grave for wheels. Still they moved, because war does not stop for weather any more than weather cares for war. Theon found himself on the King's Road with a small company, a sack of worries, and a new understanding that he had not so much picked aside as been reached for by a place and held. They met men moving south in rags and furs, ghost-eyed, telling of empty villages where a cold had come through with fingers too many for a man to count. "Walkers," one said, and kissed the haft of his spear as if the wood might like it. Theon thought of the wall and of Jon Snow, a boy who had looked at him once as if they understood one another and who had not killed him for pretending. He sent a raven north to Castle Black with what he knew, which was nothing but attended by fear, and he sent one south to Robb because a king should hear of ghosts when his men do. The answer down was as you might expect. Hold your people close, do not waste strength. Winter will help as often as harm if you know where to stand. The answer up from the wall was slower and stranger. It talked of Mance Rayder like a king who did not need a crown, of a great host of free folk moving like a river in flood, of blue eyes in the dark and a horn blast in cold air that would have cracked bones if bones cared about sound. It was signed by a man with a steady hand who had once been more bastard than brother, and it smelled like burning pine. Theon read it by firelight, and the shadow of his head on the parchment looked older than he felt. He took the letter to Bran. The boy listened as if words were animals that might bolt if he breathed wrong. When Theon finished, Bran nodded once and looked at the flames as if they might decide to be less themselves and more helpful. "We hold," he said, and Theon said, "Aye," and knew that if that meant the rest of his life was small and quiet and full of the work of keeping smaller men alive, he could wear it. Months later, men would speak in Winterfell's yard with good sheepish humor of the time Theon Greyjoy snatched a child out from under a reaver's blade like he was taking a pie from a dog. The truth was less clean. He had run because running is what you do when a scream finds the place inside you where you keep old screams. He had slipped on slush and cursed and heard his knee curse back at him. He had struck a man with his bow because his sword was under his cloak and he was not quick enough. Then he had had the child upside down by one ankle because children are slippery when frightened, and the man with the blade had made a sound like a surprise. And then Theon had been killing in that efficient way he had learned and hated. The child had clung to him as if he were a tree. When they told the story later, it grew antlers and grace. Theon let it grow. He did not correct men when they needed to tell it that way. He wrote again to the islands because old things pull, and because Asha had a mouth that made truth a game he could enjoy. He told her simply that the North would not burn the way knives wanted it to burn. She sent back a letter that smelled like tar and laughed at him and sighed for him both, as much as ink can laugh and sigh. "You picked a hard bride," she wrote. "Stone wears you down until you fit it, but when it keeps you, it keeps you. I will bring my men to pluck fish out of the Lannisters' wine cups, because it amuses me. I will not kneel to a wolf. You should not kneel to a squid. We will be ourselves." He read that letter in the solar with Maester Luwin asleep over his own list of small good things and thought that if the world left him one person who could be truth with him, he could breathe. Years later, men would argue in low halls lit by tallow whether Theon Greyjoy had saved Winterfell. Too much had saved it for it to belong to one man. Snow that slowed ships, wolves who listened to a boy and hunted where he pointed, farmers who kept back 3 sacks for the Lord's people even when they had 5 and should have kept 2. The gods saved it in the way gods save anything, which is to say the trees stood, and sometimes that is all. Theon did what he said he would, and sometimes the size of a vow is measured not by how it is sworn, or to whom, but by the fact that it is kept in the quiet. Once, he came to the Godswood when the sky was the hard blue of cold so clear it cuts. Bran was there with his face lifted, listening. Jojen slept on a bed of dry leaves, his hand on the roots as if they were fingers. Mira stared at the fish that did not freeze in the black water, admiration and murder for them mixed on her skilled face. Theon stood and did not speak. The heart tree watched him. He thought of the boy he had been and the man his father wanted and the knife he had almost become. He thought of Robb's hand on his shoulder and of the clatter of wolves' paws on stone. He thought of a bridge and a gale and a crown like rot in the sea. He knelt then, at last, not to ask but to admit. He felt the cold in his knee through leather. The bark was rough. Behind his closed eyes, the smell of smoke and snow braided itself into something he could bear. "Watch me," he said, low enough that it could be mistaken for breath. The leaves moved without wind. He felt rather than heard Bran draw nearer. The boy's palm was light on his hair. The touch was a kindness from a king who was not yet king and might never be anything but a boy who grew into a tree. Theon's head bowed without shame. He had no prayers. He had kept what he could. He would go on. In that other river of time, he had burned boys and he had become something colder than winter and smaller than the word man. In this one, he warmed his hands at the fire in a hall of stone and walked out into snow that did not eat him. The sea was still there for him if he wanted it. He did not. 3 days after he knelt, a raven came from the wall with ink blotted where a word had been written too fast, in tired hands. It spoke of dead men who would not stay down and of wildlings like storm clouds, of a horn that had blown 3 times that woke nightmares in old songs. It asked for oaths to be remembered. It asked for wood and men and bread. Theon took it to Bran, who held the parchment as if it might shiver like a living thing. He asked Theon to ride to White Harbor with what he had and to bring back what he could. "You still have your road," Bran said. "And I still have mine. Then we both go where we belong," Theon answered, and smiled, not because he needed to, nor because it would make anyone like him better, but because the world had given him a place and he had learned to be in it without baring his teeth. He clapped Jojen on the shoulder and told Mira to mind Bran with the sort of gruffness you use when you want to hide how much you care. She rolled her eyes and called him Lord with a kink to her mouth that said she would spear him if he forgot himself. He told Osha to stop scaring boys for sport, and she snarled and told him he could not take that pleasure. It was all she had left. They saddled, and the yard smelled of leather and horse and cold. Ser Roderick hugged him with a hard arm and told him not to die, as if death were a rude habit. Maester Luwin fussed at his cloak and smacked his hand when Theon tried to help. Bran looked at him without saying anything. Felt like words anyway. He rode through the gate and the wind found every gap in his clothes and made itself at home. He turned once to look back, as everyone who has ever left that gate does, whether they are going to the gods or the market. Winterfell stood. Smoke rose from the kitchen and was carried away and remade by weather a dozen times. Crows rose from the first tower, a small ink stain spreading in the pale day. He felt something take root in him that was as deep as it was unshowy. He rode on. The road to White Harbor was worse than last time. He had fewer men than it would be comfortable to have and more than he could feed if the world decided to make a point. He found a farmhouse with a woman who had 4 daughters and 1 spear and traded them a bag of salt for a cheese that made his tongue cry, and he sat by their fire and let the youngest braid his hair and believed he would remember her laugh when he needed to. He found a frozen stream where the ice sang and felt like it knew him. He found a dead man face down in the snow with blue at the edges of the coin of his eye. He buried him because even a stranger should go under the ground when the ground will take him, and he taught 2 boys who had never held a spade how to say a quiet North word over a man in a pit. He did not think of the sea except when he heard it inside the shell of his ear at night. At White Harbor, Lord Wyman Manderly looked at him out of eyes set in a pink face like generosity had been made into a person and asked him if he wanted 3 pies. Theon wanted 1 pie and the ships he came for. The Lord gave him both and more than he had asked for. "A north that stands is a city that thrives," Manderly said, and ordered a dockman who had been slow about a rope to be kind to himself for a week as penance. Theon laughed and liked the man then, because liking men who are easy to like can be an act of courage when the world says be hard. He left with barrels of dried fish and iron nails and a promise that 3 of Manderly's heavier cogs would carry grain to Eastwatch if the weather held and a sailmaster said a thing that made sense. On the way back, he met a band of men with tatters where their banners had been. They had a stag chalked on their leather, but the antlers were wrong for a king and right for a man who had bought chalk. They told him that men in crowns had died and that the world had laughed or wept accordingly. Theon gave them sausages because the world does not care who you swore to if your stomach empties itself. In a village he had never known the name of, he taught a boy to draw a bow with his fingers and not his shoulders and watched the boy find the way strength can be a loop and not a line. He rode with a song in his head that had no words and sounded like hooves on packed snow. When he came again to Winterfell, it was dusk. The hall doors were open to let the smoke out and the warmth in. He stepped under the stone, and something that had been chasing him since he was 10 found at last that it could not follow. He gave Lord Manderly's letter to Maester Luwin and to Ld Bran that he had got ships and men and pies. The boy laughed truly. The laugh warmed a place in Theon that had thought itself dead. Later, when he went again to the God's Wood, the moon was a chip broken from bone. He stood with his back against the heart tree and thought of every road his feet had not taken. He thought of the sea and its old claims, of the bridge and the wind that had pushed a man off it and the water that had made him nothing, of Robb and the day he had been a boy with a wolf, and of a king who had become a story men told with pride, of Jojen's eyes when they looked past you and into always, of Osha's hands making a fire regardless. He felt the tree at his back, rough and there. He let himself feel it. He had never been good at prayers. He did not start. He stood and breathed and knew that if the world kept hurling men like him at it, and if enough of those men chose stone over salt in a pinch, then perhaps the walls would hold for another season and another after that, until boys he would never meet had the luck to laugh through a winter. He could not give them more than this. He could certainly give them that. Snow began to fall, thin and clean. He tilted his face up to it and let it pinprick his skin. He smiled then, at last without harm in it, and when he went back inside, the hall welcomed him with its old heat, and the wolves lifted their heads from the hearth, and every simple thing was right enough to be born. He took his place where he had made it. He listened to the wind banging respectfully at the shutters, asking to be let in. He did not get up. He had work in the morning. He would do it. He would keep his vow, and in the keeping, become the thing he had never known he might be.